Hello, class. This is your instructor responding to the podcast on systemic racism in the United States. And this podcast was between Larry Elder and the host, Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin is someone who comes from the political left, although he calls himself a classical liberal now. And Larry Elder is definitely a conservative. While they talk about a lot of issues in this podcast, such as affirmative action and the phrase or term African American, which Larry Elder apparently rejects and thinks it's ridiculous, he would prefer to be called black, I would like to focus in this slide on a couple criminal justice issues that they brought up. And so if we are to believe that there is systemic racism throughout the United States, then we might want to look to the criminal justice system to see if we can find any evidence of this. Dave Rubin, as you can tell, felt though he had a point that there was systemic racism, and you could point to the criminal justice system as clear evidence of this because there are more black males in prison, and he assumed incorrectly that the reason for this was perhaps the war on drugs. And they also talk about police shootings, that because of recent media coverage of some very unfortunate, awful situations where police had to shoot or felt that they needed to use deadly force against a suspect, that we are left with the impression that there is an epidemic of police shootings against unarmed black men. Well, is this true? First, with the police shootings, because there is video footage of this happening, does not necessarily mean, though, that police shootings overall are disproportionately happening to black men. In fact, when we look at the research, we find that police are no more likely to shoot a black suspect than they are a white suspect. And if anything, according to research by Roland Fryer, that it is whites who are slightly more likely to be shot by police. There is another reading I'm going to post in a later slide that gets into this in greater detail about how police are more likely to put their hands on black suspects. But when it comes to deadly police shootings, there's either no racial difference or, if anything, whites are slightly more likely to be shot. The other issue that is often brought up almost reflexively by individuals on the political left is the idea that the war on drugs has been waged disproportionately against blacks, and that this is the reason why you have incarceration rates growing in the United States, have been growing in the United States over the last several decades. And they certainly have been growing, and by a lot. But much of that growth may be a reflection of the growing violence over the last several decades, which has slowed down starting in the 1990s, actually. But if we look at who is in prison and for what, first of all, most people go to state prisons, not federal prisons. And if we look at the chart, you'll see in the chart that the majority of people in state prisons, the single largest category, is for violent offenses. Drug offenses, on the other hand, account for only about 15% of people in state prisons. It is larger in federal prisons, that is the percent of people who are in there for nonviolent drug offenses. However, the majority of people, the vast majority of people, do not go to federal prison. They go to state prison. And so this, in another interview, Larry Elder and Dave Rubin revisit some of these issues, and you're able to go into YouTube and watch that second interview, and I encourage you to do that because it sort of dovetails off the conversation that they're having here. But it is important to recognize that we need to remain objective when looking at these controversial issues. And this is one of the reasons why, as college instructors, we normally don't allow you all to cite mainstream media as a scholarly source, because it's not. And it's not as if they're just making things up. They will present facts in a way that distorts the reality of the situation, with constant hammering on police shootings of black men. You don't get the full picture that if anything, there is no racial bias. And likewise, with constant reminders of how many nonviolent individuals are going to prison for drug offenses, we don't realize that really what we're talking about there are people going to federal prisons, not state prisons. And state prisons, again, are where most criminals go. In your responses, most of you found something to like in Larry Elder, and how could you not? It's not as if he is a right-wing kook. He's definitely conservative, but remember, he's also definitely against the war on drugs, that he thinks it's illegitimate, that the government needed to pass a new amendment to the Constitution to do it, just like they did for prohibition back in the 1920s. And so this is something that Larry Elder on the right actually agrees with Michelle Alexander on the left, who we will discuss in the next slide. So I hope you enjoyed this, and there will be more to come. But if you have not watched this, please encourage you to do it. That is, watch the full interview. And until next time, bye-bye.